Afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you are in the United States. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kadri Tastan. I am Senior Fellow with the GMF here in Brussels, and I will moderate this discussion today for you. My colleague Ian Nesser, Vice President of GMF and also GMF Brussels Office Director, was supposed to moderate this meeting, but due to the new situation, there's an emergency executive meeting at GMF, and so he will not be able to join us today. Our apologies for this. Of course, the focus of this meeting will change considerably, as you can imagine, as the Russian invasion started this morning. This meeting was planned a long time ago, and it's a sad coincidence to do it now at the moment where there is a war in the Eastern Europe. Indeed, despite all the efforts of de-escalation on the part of Americans and Europeans, despite the threat of sanctions. So with this invasion and that began this morning, Putin showed that he had already made his decision. The sanction put in place by the Europeans and Americans were not enough to deter Putin. So the question now is how far Russian army will go, maybe the current NATO border. From an humanitarian point of view, of course, for the Ukrainian, it's horrible and there will be really terrible consequences. But this invasion will have also implication for the security of Europe, for NATO and its members. So many questions and concerns, of course, are. And our panelists will help us to understand a bit what is going on now and what can potentially happen in the long term. And we have put a great panel for you today. Just let me to please introduce them very briefly. We have Galip Dalay with us. Galip is a Katz fellow with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Then we have Liana. Liana is now with a resident fellow with the GMF in Washington, DC. And then we have Jonathan Katz, another colleague. Jonathan is a senior fellow and director of democracy initiative at the GMF in DC. And we have also Maryna Vorotnyuk. Maryna, sorry, is associate fellow with the RUSI in London. So thank you so much for joining. I know that you are all very tired and you have been following this event since early morning. So thanks a lot. So first of all, I will give the floor to our speakers to have their introductory remarks, and then I will, of course, ask some question to our speakers and have a short maybe conversation with them. And then we will, of course, open up to all of you. And just to say, this is on the record. And if you like to put your question, there's a Q&A function. You know all now very well the Zoom. And we will keep track them and we will get as many of you as we can. So please specify also to whom you are asking your questions. So just before starting, I would like to also thank to our partner, the Union of Chambers and Community Exchange of Turkey, TOBB, for their generous support. Because this online event is a part of series and events and analysis organized as part of GMF TOBB Fellowship on Turkey, Europe and Global Issues, launched by GMF in partnership with the TOBB in 2017. So with this, I would like to start with you, Maryna. You, for your introductory remarks, you have 5-6 minutes. Please go ahead, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kadri, and thanks to the GMF for this opportunity to speak today. It's very difficult to be starting this discussion today because, as you can imagine, and Kadri, as you mentioned, that while we all, probably the speakers here, were taking our notes, preparing our bullet points for the discussion just last night, many of our suggestions which were pending in the air, we didn't know exactly what is going to happen, and we were just speculating Turkey's response. And actually, this is what I was going to say. I was going to say that we have so many unknown variables and different scenarios that that Turkey, of course, will impact Turkey's decision making and Turkey's policy on Russia and Turkey's policy on Ukraine. And it looks like that Turkey is now at a very critical juncture when actually some of the painful and probably even uncomfortable choices have to be made or are under consideration, at least since what is happening in Ukraine with the reinvasion of Russia into Ukrainian territory. So for Turkey, lots of things are at stake here. We all understand there. It has been discussed already profoundly at different discussions at the formal level, and that it's one of this, humanitarian crisis in the heart of Europe. Ukrainian-Turkish relations, cooperation, trade ties, to tourism, but also the strategic posture. We can only imagine how that can affect Turkey's strategic posture in the Black Sea. And I think that we've seen how Turkey has tried to match up and develop its sort of deterring policy towards Russia after 2014, complementing it with a very specific approach to Russia, developing at the same time the strategic partnership with Russia, recognizing Russia's crucial role in the regional architecture. So this all has to be now in a very, I would say, in a very difficult way reassessed and understood how Turkey can actually, accommodate the claims or the requests coming from both sides, from NATO, from Russia, but also from Ukraine. What we've seen in the media, the Ukrainian ambassador requesting officially Turkey to close the straits for the passage of the Russian ships, to introduce the sanctions, which we know Turkey did not do before, saying that sanctions are not actually an efficient instrument vis-à-vis Russia, and the dialogue should be maintained, and it could be allegedly a more effective way to deal with Russia. So I would argue that just last night I was going to say that if Russia stops, does not put into use the forces that it had at its border with Ukraine, that it would be much easier for Ankara, alongside with the strong statement that was made, we've seen from the Turkish MFA about the non-recognition of what is happening, of Russia's recognition of the Donbas and Lugansk People Republics, that Turkey condemns it. But then if Russia would have stopped short of reinvading, of crossing the contact line and actually encircling Ukraine, and we see the airstrikes and missile strikes from around the perimeter, from the south, from the north, and from the east. So now it's much more difficult for Turkey to say that those relations with Turkey, with Russia and Ukraine are equally important for it, and kind of equalizing the strategic partnerships with both countries. So I think this is something that is very well understood in Ankara at the moment, and we will see. I think it's we are talking in a very turbulent moment when everything is in flux. So it will all, of course, depend on what is happening in Ukraine in the following hours and days, and what is happening with Ukraine's sovereignty as such, with Ukrainian statehood as such. So if Ukraine withstands this, or what is happening. So we really see very serious questions here. So the last point I will make, just not to abuse those 5 minutes, which I'm already running off. So just to say that there was lots of hopes and discussions about Turkey's deterrent potential vis-a-vis Russia, and lots of discussion in Ukraine about that. Especially understood, of course, we understand why this was happening because of with this very dynamic defense and security cooperation, with the supply of the drones. When Ukrainian armed forces put to use Bayraktars in the east of the Ukraine and repelling the attack from the pro-Russian forces there. So it was everywhere in the headlines. And of course, this cooperation in the defense and security sphere has been everywhere. Turkey has been one of the most popular partners, if you ask the Ukrainians, alongside with the US and the UK, since it supplied those very crucial and important military supply. And the last point, I think still many tend to overestimate this Turkey's deterrent potential vis-a-vis Russia. We can discuss this later a bit, but I would just shortly argue there are lots of vulnerabilities that Turkey has, deeply rooted historical vulnerabilities that Russia is very free-handedly going to utilize and has already done it actually before vis-a-vis Turkey. And also, I would argue the last point, that Turkey's growing rift with NATO allies, with the US, it also adds up to the picture and probably also not allows us to say that Russia would really perceive Ankara as this full-fledged, actor in the Black Sea, ready and willing, moreover, to resort to this full-fledged deterrence, because this has not been the case, I would argue, so far. I will stop here. Thank you.
Maryna, thank you so much. We will come back to you. I would be interested to hear what you are also expecting to happen, of course. As I said at the beginning, now this meeting was planned to focus more on Turkey's position, but now we are in a new configuration. Please, let's try to keep it a bit larger, not only focus on Turkey's position, as you perfectly done. You have already done, Maryna. So, Galip, if you wish, we can continue with you. Over to you. You have 5 minutes, also 5-6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Sure, Kadri. Thank you. Well, I think me representing, perhaps being from Turkey, many people will think that I should be talking about Turkish position mostly, so that would be my conversation. I think the statement that we are seeing thus far coming from Ankara pretty much represent Ankara's position and what it is likely to do. What does this statement represent? On the one hand, the statement has rejected the Russia's recognition of Donbas and Lugansk as independent. They have emphasized the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, but they also, at the same time, in today's Erdogan's tweet, which was very carefully crafted, they also keep calling for the dialogue and keep calling both sides as friends. And they did not use the word war. Erdogan said the military operations, not the war, because if you use the word wars, then it will have an implication on the Turkey's application of Turkey's approach to the Montreux Conventions, because Turkey's approach on the Montreux Convention, particularly when it comes to whether it can close the straits to the Russian vessel or not, it very much depends on how Turkey frames what is happening. If it frames it as war, then that will put some obligation on Turkey to restrict, at least, if not close, to restrict at least the navigation of the vessels or the navals belonging to the warring sides. And this was precisely what the Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey today has requested. I don't think that it will be granted anytime soon, as long as Turkey doesn't frame it as war. But it will be how Turkey is going to frame it will very much depend how deep the crisis will go and how long it will last, but also most importantly, to what extent the West is willing to confront Russia and in what way. This all will very much inform the Turkey's position. So Turkey will be looking at the Western position to a very significant extent to formulate its own position. If all the West will do, more or less, will be confined to some form of sanctions and the economic sanctions, then highly likely Turkey will continue with its so-called hedging strategy or the balancing strategy. At the same time, it will continue to supply Ukraine with the defense equipment items. It has already been doing it, but not going for a full-fledged confrontation with Russia. The crisis is coming particularly in a delicate period for the government, for the Turkish government, for Ankara. It is economically, there is a deepening economic crisis in the country, and this is very much going to have implication on whether the government will be able to win the next election or not. And the Ukrainian and Russian combined accounts for something like 30% of the tourists, or in other trade items, economic items, the energy items. Secondly, Turkey is overexposed to Russia because of the mutual interdependency in different conflict zones in the Middle East, in South Caucasus. That also as major factor that Turkey has to factor in its calculation. And thirdly, this crisis is happening at a time when the Turkish-Western relationship in a deep crisis as well too. Therefore, the fact that Turkey was not invited thus far, bearing the current invitation, Turkey was not invited to the conversation that took place between the different Western actors on this recent first crisis and now war in itself is indicative. Turkey, despite the convergence of interest, as Maryna rightly put it, on many accounts, actually, Turkey has been very closer to UK and US when it comes to providing the defense equipments to the Ukrainian side, but perhaps closer to Germany when it comes to back then preferring dialogue or full-fledged confrontation. But Turkey was not involved in any dialogue that took place on the subjects. So all these factors will very much shape the Ankara's assessment. At this stage, I don't think that Turkey will join the sanction regimes. The Erdogan spokesperson and his chief foreign policy advisor has already said so. B, I don't anticipate Turkey closing the straits anytime soon, and Turkey not using the word war at this stage is indicative. So the moment the Turkish officials start to use vocabulary of war in defining what is happening, then we can anticipate that there might be some steps on putting restriction, if not closing the straits to Russia. As long as it doesn't do so, we can interpret this as Turkey not doing, as not taking steps on this regard, while at the same time it will continue to provide the Ukrainian side with armed drones and other activities. And lastly, let's not forget Turkey. Another reason that Turkey itself is right now under the Katz sanction, the US Katz sanction. So this is also another factor that will Turkey into account.
Thank you so much, Galip. Liana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kadri. I think perhaps the most useful contribution that I can make at this point is trying to sketch out how the European security environment might look like after this war. And this is really just a sketch, and where Turkey will have to fit in after this war. And I think the one thing that we certainly know for sure already is that this war means that NATO will return to its very core mission. So NATO will be back as defense alliance defending Europe against Russia. And that will be the fundamental mission that it will uphold for many years to come. And it will also lead to some extent to perhaps a new bifurcation in Europe between NATO and Russia and the territories that Russia will control. We will see more US troops in Europe, especially in the Baltic states. We will probably is too much, perhaps see the NATO-Russia Founding Act officially scrapped. And we will also see, or perhaps hope to see, the European Union upping its security and defense policy. So Turkey as a NATO member will have to fit into this new era of confrontation between NATO and Russia that will continue beyond the war that we see right now. We will certainly not see a NATO-Russia war. This is obviously not in the interest of anyone, but we will see down the road possible escalations and crises between NATO, between Europe and Russia. Let's think about missile stationings and so on. At the same time, we will also see a state of continuous economic conflict with mutual sanctions, energy blackmailing, cyber attacks and retaliation for European sanctions. So the state really of high-end tensions in all areas, and my colleague Michael Kimmich and I tried to describe this in the Foreign Affairs article as economic warfare, geopolitical struggle, and at the same time, the necessity to keep up dialogue with Russia to prevent a NATO-Russia conflict. Giving Russians military dominance, and given that military analysts have analyzed how this campaign will play out, and the US intelligence has also done this, we might have to move quickly to the question whether we arm a Ukrainian insurgency and resistance. So the military dominance of Russia will give Ukraine little chance to stand this attack. So who would arm this insurgency? I mean, right now there have been reports, unverified, that Turkish drones have been used to stop an offensive right now in the east. How would Turkey position itself when it comes to supplying Ukrainian resistance and insurgency with weapons directly against Russia? And then the speech of the Russian president yesterday night was very clear about the threats towards all NATO members and towards everyone trying to meddle into the conflict. And it's a very, it was not a real threat, it was a very clear threat that suggests also some, from a country, let's say it this way, from a country which has nuclear weapons and threatens everyone not to get involved. And I would assume that Turkey is sort of included in this threat made from the Russian side. So it seemed to be that this was a very strong signaling towards all NATO actors, including Turkey, which might also influence Turkey's calculus. So I think what we will, I sketched out and think aloud, what we will see is we will have on the one side pressure from NATO, certainly on Turkey, because NATO will rally around the flag, it will redefine itself, and it will be much less tolerant towards Turkey's balancing as it has been in the past, because this is now serious for Europe, and Europe has been for a long time. In the last weeks, Europe was always the holdout for those who hope that this is all just a coercion strategy, that this is all a bluff, this is just to have more leverage in negotiations. Whereas here in Washington, Jonathan knows this better, but here in Washington it's very serious that this war can take place. And in Europe, there was a hope for a really long time that this is just a bluff, which will mean in consequence that Europeans are perhaps even more shocked than the United States is at the moment at what is happening, because there was a continuous hope that this is not going to happen and this step cannot be taken by the Russian side. And again, this will lead to this welling around the flag effect. Following the news from Germany today, I can say that this is already very visible in Germany, that Russia is redefined as an enemy, certainly, and that there will be very and especially, I mean, we're just at the beginning of the campaign, and if we take US intelligence and report seriously, we have to look at human rights violations, to put it mildly, down the road. And again, Jonathan can talk more. We'll certainly talk more about that. But if we come to this stage of the campaign, this will become even more brutal than what we see right now, which seems still to be sort of, it's not surgical military strike as strikes as the Russian Defense Ministry said, but this is sort of still the military campaign. This is not yet down to the purge that was literally announced today, also by the Russian, the spokesperson of the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, and the liberation and denazification that was announced by the president yesterday night. So it can get much worse than what we see right now. Again, this will lead to this rallying around the flag effect in Europe and within NATO. So we will have pressure on the one side by NATO on Turkey, and on the other side, we will have immense pressure by Russia to try to I would expect immense pressure by Russia to try to somehow make Turkey not follow along within the NATO bloc, to try to get Turkey out of this NATO unity, at least by some ways. And I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think about whether this and how this could play out. I think it will be a very difficult situation for Turkey to go along. It will be a very difficult situation for all of us, because Ukraine, as this balancing factor in Turkish foreign policy, will probably not be there anymore as we know it from the past. And again, the European security environment will just change so fundamentally, and it will be such an existential topic again to Europeans and NATO, which it has not been in the past, that this will not be perceived from NATO's side as playing games anymore. This will be serious in the coming weeks and months, especially if we have follow-up crises between Europe and Russia in the next months and years. That was perhaps not entirely as coherent as I wished it to be, but looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Liana. Well, Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And everything that Liana just said is, I think, very much spot on. And, I think, one thing that you're seeing is obviously this, which we all do, which is condemn this invasion. And I'm glad, Liana, that you brought up, this is, I think from the US perspective, and I think in Europe as well too, the spin from Russia is that this was about the Donbass and securing, providing security there. And this is anything but that. And I think it's just important. I know this is a broader conversation, and I'll talk about Turkey, but for those that are in Turkey that are looking at this, or Europe or elsewhere globally, to recognize what this is, a full-scale invasion. And I think from the perspective of the United States, what Liana said too, which is there is a great deal of concern about the escalation in Ukraine. When you hear the terminology denazify or demilitarization, this is a code for the type of human rights abuses that have sort of led to the worst atrocities globally. So I think we take it, the United States is taking that very seriously. President Biden came out late last night with a statement, condemning this, pointing exactly, and I think from the international community, who's responsible for what's taken place for the current situation. And I think that's important. I think what we will expect to see today, and I think this very much impacts Turkey, whether they want to or not, is the sanctions that are to come, the depth of those sanctions, the targeting of Russian state-owned banks. I think anybody doing with business with Russia in a significant way, energy sector, multiple other sectors, is going to be also in that line of fire. And so that will certainly impact Turkey. But for right now, I think our heart goes out to the Ukrainian people who are sort of facing this moment and thinking through the things that they need. And so the things that we're talking about today, I think this is, and I'll talk about where I think Turkey is in all this, but I think we really need to, as Liana said, this is not just a momentary, we're at the beginning of something much more significant. You wrote a great piece with that, Liana, with Michael Kimmage, that talked about breaking down some of the consequences, but they're really, I don't view this, and I think in Washington, there's no view that this is a short-term issue. Everybody is gearing up for longer-term conflict. As Liana pointed out, the Biden administration will come out with its new national security strategy, I suspect, in a couple of weeks. I think they held back because of this current situation and the need to recalibrate. We didn't bring up China in this. Obviously, right now, the United States is preparing for, and I think this is with partners and allies, that there could be two fronts, not just one. There's one right now. So the US is definitely in a balancing act to try to figure out how best to deal with these issues. I suspect too, that we're likely to see not only the force posture change, which Liana talked about, in the East. But I think this will have repercussions globally as well for the United States, how it positions itself in the Indo-Pacific, how it's going to position itself in Europe. And, it wasn't lost on me. I want to get to Turkey to speak to this, that, the new ambassador, Jeff Flake, US ambassador, said the other day regarding the cooperation between Turkey and the United States and NATO. He said Turkey is an important NATO member. It has the second largest F-16 fleet, and it's the third largest contributor to NATO missions. I think there will be an expectation that if force posture changes, that Turkey will be a more significant contributor because it has assets to be able to contribute. And so I think when I'm hearing this and I hear him talk about F-16s, it reminds me of the F-35 situation, whether or not there is an opening, to engage on some of the stickier issues. The United States and Turkey have set up a mechanism. I don't think it's fully functioning yet to resolve some of the more difficult issues that have really harmed the relationship over the last several years. I hope that there is a moment that we speed up that process. I think there's a moment, hopefully, to see if some of these issues can be resolved, because I think Turkey will certainly be relied on significantly. So I want to just quickly talk about Turkey. Galip, I don't think that Turkey, and I think Liana focused on this as well, the days of sitting on two different stools it will no longer be feasible. Now we're seeing Turkey is a member of NATO. They are signing on to the NAC statements, and the one that came out early this morning in Brussels. And so I think there's an expectation that they're going to follow through, support that, not be a hindrance within NATO, to do the things that we need to do, but be a contributor within NATO, just as Ambassador Flake pointed out. On sanctions, I understand that the government has said that it will not enforce these sanctions. I don't think it's going to have a choice, because I think that the severity of the sanctions within the global banking system is going to require Turkey, at a minimum, to not be a go-around. It may not decide to explicitly say that it is going to enforce and implement sanctions, but it cannot be a space like it was for Iran to go around this. So Turkey will absolutely, there's a recognition, even from over the last decade, that Turkey was being used, Turkish banks. I don't think that will be something that people will look beyond, and could have ramifications for the relationship if the Turkish government allows that to happen. Humanitarian assistance. Turkey has experienced more refugees fleeing, any country. They're host millions right now. Right now, there are already Ukrainians fleeing into countries like Moldova. Turkey has a good relationship with Moldova and has had that. Really important to see, and I'd like to see Turkey, through its humanitarian assistance right now, place its foothold in a country like Moldova to provide that support. But I also think it's important in terms of sending a signal about what, and Turkey should not be the only one doing this. I would urge that EU member states also step up to put humanitarian missions on the ground in a country like Moldova. Turkey has a great deal of experience. I think that's important. Turkey is also going to experience concerns about its flank. It's not lost on anybody that countries that are vulnerable to Russia and Russian threats include Georgia. I mentioned Moldova, but Turkey has made significant strides. We know it's nascent with Armenia as well, on rapprochement. Seeing how that plays out, how Russia can be a spoiler, is important, but I'm more worried about Georgia right now, and Georgian security. Nobody was talking about the military exercises that were taking place in the Skin-Valley region. This is an area of Georgia now controlled largely by Russian military and proxies there, and they are incredibly vulnerable. Does Turkey want to wake up tomorrow with a border with Russia, with Russian troops in Georgia? We already have Russian troops in Georgia, but on the border, something much more significant. And it's not out of the question when you hear Putin's speech that he gave a couple of days ago when he talks about the mistake of the breakup of the Soviet Union, the loss of these states, that they're not in, that Ukraine's not independent. It's a creation of Russia. Georgia has also been and faced its own war. In fact, it's one of the mistakes that many people point to was that the lack of reaction to what took place. So these spaces, the South Caucasus, Balkans, Western Balkans, where Turkey does play a role, will be particularly important. So again, I'm going to end here. This is not a short war. This is a long war. Turkey can't sit on two fences. We should expect, by the way, in the United States, pretty shortly, a new round of sanctions. It can't come soon enough from my perspective, and that will be done in coordination with partners and allies across the world. Turkey can't step aside, and it's going to be asked to do more. I agree with Liana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Well, before I just remind the audience that they can put their question here on the bottom of the Zoom window. But I would like to turn to you, Maryna. At this stage, is there any option for Ukraine to negotiate with Russia? What do you think on that? For example, to declare that it will never join NATO or recognize the independence of the eastern Ukrainian enclave of Donetsk or Lugansk? And I would like to have also your take on how far do you think Putin wants to go? Is it full-fledged invasion or division of the country? What do you think on that? Briefly.
Yeah, unfortunately, what we see at the moment is the time of diplomacy is over. And if there were hopes that dialogue with Russia can solve some of those burning and urgent problems that Russia and West have developed in the recent years, or that better say Russia has created for the West in the recent years. So I think these were all erroneous judgments. And we've seen that those intentions, they were very benign, of course, and we were trying to reach out to Russia, offering all kinds of, negotiations on strategic stability and on any other questions that we've seen, or the West has seen the space for the discussions. Unfortunately, I think that our hopes that Russia would already start the negotiation, at least on those issues, with the spillover effect, etc. I think it was bluntly rejected, and we've seen it. On your question, what Ukraine would choose to do now, I mean, it's very difficult. It has been already mentioned by previous speakers here that it looks like if Putin's speech tonight, early morning, is any reference of Russia's intentions at the very moment, it's to demilitarize, denazify Ukraine, which I agree means actually to topple to the government in Kiev and to try to install the pro-Russian government. I mean, which is, again, before the invasion, before tonight's attack, we were saying that Kremlin would need really to count the costs of such an action, because it's one thing is to invade, but another thing is try to keep Ukraine under occupation. Well, President Putin now claims that keeping Ukraine under occupation is not an option, but rather I would say, in a very appalling cynicism, he addressed the Ukrainian people saying that now let's move forward, and we came here to defend you against the Kiev fascists and junta. So either this is a very disastrous thinking in Kremlin about that they are going to be welcomed with the civilian population in Ukraine is going to be welcoming the Russian soldiers. Anyways, this is disastrous, and this will lead, and we already see this, to a huge loss of life, human life. So this is going to be disaster. So I cannot see any way that Ukraine at the moment, even under the guns, under the threat of imminent destruction, would say that, all right, we are changing the constitution, and that what we are going to do is we are going to, to accept the Russia-imposed scenarios or the variants, some sorts of Finlandization, whatever, the neutrality. I think this is something out of the cards. It's not in the cards, of course. So what we are facing now, unfortunately, is one of the biggest tragedies in the last decades in the world history. So, and your last question on how it will all develop. I mean, this is all, again, we've thought this through in the last months and weeks, talking about different scenarios and how it all will develop. There's so many issues there. Now we at the moment we hear that the attack was successfully repelled at certain directions and certain perimeters of Ukrainian border. That the resistance is there. The strongest part, according to the Ukrainian MOD's reports, has been actually next to the contact line with the Donbass, where naturally the preparedness has been, I mean, one of the highest and one of the best planned, probably, with the most serious military posture there that Ukrainian armed forces had. So it's difficult to say what is to follow, and of course it's very much depends what Russia is planning to do at the moment. But again, I don't see really that even if there is, any worst case scenarios, that Ukrainian government as it is going to negotiate some sort of drastic change of the country course.
Thank you so much, Maryna. But Galip, maybe we can go back to this Turkey's, Ankara's position. You have already mentioned that Ukraine asked Turkey to close Bosphorus and Dardanelles straight to Russian ship. And how do you see, I mean, Ankara handling really this situation? How will Ankara strike a balance between West and Russia? Maybe you can a bit elaborate on this?
Sure.
Be great.
Sure. Before this, I think a few other remarks as well. For long, we have discussed whether the post-Cold War international order or global order experiencing a slow death. There was debate, there was discussion, there was contestation whether this was the case or not. But I think what we have experienced this morning was whatever remained of this order had a heart attack this morning. So we are sure now it is dead. It died this morning. So even if it wasn't dead already, this morning it died. So we are entering a new period, and the new period will require all of us to develop new languages about the conversation. I agree with Jonathan. The nature of Turkish-Western relationship was never decided by some bureaucrats in Brussels. It was decided by the global level developments, systemic level developments, the bigger geopolitical picture. And this is another bigger geopolitical picture that will have formative impact, qualitative impact on the future of Turkish-Western relationship. And in this regard, I think we are yet to grasp the severity and the depth of this process. We can go all the way to the 1856 Turkey Ottoman joining the Paris, joining the Paris Treaty as a result of the Crimea War, and that was one of the first incidents of Ottoman being seen as part of the European international order. Then we can come to the post-Second World War development, NATO. So all these developments, the nature of Turkish-Western relationship was largely defined by the systemic level and global level developments, and therefore. Secondly, thus far when we use the word hedging or balancing act, but this was a period in which we discussed the Russian-Western relationship in terms of rivalry, not war. If it was a rivalry, then you can engage in geopolitical balancing act or in hedging option. I think if we are discussing this new phase in the terminology of war, then it is about the choices, not balancing. And I think this is something that Ankara soon will face. So the geopolitical balancing act, the hedging strategy, belong to a period in which we discuss the Chinese-Russian-Western relationship in the vocabulary of rivalries, not war. So the war is about the choices, and this is why I think I agree with the general assessment. Then now Turkey will be pressed hard to make choices because this is war we are talking about. And as part of it, as I said, still I don't think that Turkey will actively join the sanction, but then there will be again the global system level sanctions that Turkey cannot avoid it. It will have to, whether it like it or not, it will highly likely will abide by them. So I think now what we are seeing, whether Turkey will actively engage actively impose the sanctions, or will be passively obliged to follow the global level sanctions or the Western sanctions. This is the distinction that we will be seeing. At this stage, I don't think that Turkey will be actively imposing sanctions, but I think if the West puts really severe sanctions, then I think Turkey will be passively obliged to abide by them. And then another point at this stage, I think going forward, the Turkey will emphasize more and more its NATO identity, and more than what we have seen in the last few years, because now there are two real competition is taking place. The systemic level rivalry with China now being complemented by a geopolitical rivalry with Russia through a war. So, and these two things, the systemic rivalry and geopolitical rivalry, I think will leave no room but Turkey to emphasize more and more its NATO identity, and that's why going forward, I do anticipate more convergence actually between the US or the NATO and Turkey. Not only what is happening in Ukraine, I mean, for sure, mostly because of what is happening in Ukraine, but also look at the Balkans right now, the Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Serb nationalist attempts to break up the country. Right, what we are seeing, this geopolitical rivalry will have its implication in different conflict zones, in Eastern Mediterranean, in Middle East, in South Caucasus, in Balkans, in Africa, because this is in the process of being a globalized war. What we are seeing in Ukraine is in the process of being a globalized war with also a war of narrative. So in this new period, I anticipate more convergence. The question is, will the convergence turn into an active cooperation? Because thus far, what we have seen, there have been convergence, but these convergences have not been translated into active cooperation from the both sides. The Turkey not, not joining some, the Turkey not being even invited to some of the meetings, etc., or Turkey not, not joining the prospect of sanctions. Okay. I think right now the question would be whether the convergence will turn into cooperation. And the final point on what you asked, Kadri.
Please, very briefly, Galip.
I think there will be more pressure on Turkey right now, particularly if this is going to be a longer war. There will be more and more pressure on Turkey to restrict the Russian naval presence. And if the West goes full-fledged in confronting Russia, then I think Turkey will be abiding by this, will implement this pressure. But I don't anticipate this being done immediately.
Okay, thank you so much, Galip. Thank you very much. Lina, my question on you, it would be more about Germany now. Germany, since the beginning of the crisis, has tried to prioritize the diplomacy and dialogue. And actually, finally, even stopped. It was obliged to cancel the Nord Stream 2. And there were also concerns about divisions among the European regarding this crisis, but there was still a unity toward the first announced sanction. And now that the war has broken out, do you see a consensus on the part of European countries towards Russia?
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps on Germany, and then perhaps one additional thought on Moscow's perspective. I think the reason why Germany was criticized so harshly for not delivering defensive weapons to Ukraine, what was criticized as this German tendency towards pacifism, sort of not wanting to get involved in the hard military stuff, exactly what Germany was criticized for that will lead to an even stronger response by Germany now, because a country which is alien to any military actions, which does not itself want to contribute defensive weapons out of fear of escalating, if such a country is confronted with an attack which reminds it of the darkest periods of the 20th century, then there was just no other way how this can, and then it might even have a greater shock effect on Germany than it perhaps has on France and the UK, because France and the UK are sort of used to military operations, used to pictures, they have the military sort of closer in their society. For Germany, this is a fundamental shock, and I think the responses that we've seen from Berlin today point into exactly that direction. And I really don't think that there should be concern about the reaction now when it comes to Germany. To the contrary, this is, as I said, perhaps even more shocking for Germany to see this happening in Europe than to other countries. And then perhaps one additional thought on Moscow's calculus. What in the last weeks has been quite often done is, or what we have perhaps underestimated, is that we have applied sort of our own cost-benefit analysis to Moscow, right? So in our own cost-benefit analysis, such an invasion would have been unimaginable, because and that's why so many argue it is irrational. I don't think it is irrational. It's very rational if such a campaign was planned for 1 year, and even the declaration of war was taped 2 days ago. So there's nothing irrational about it. But the cost-benefit calculus that we just apply in our thinking just doesn't apply to Moscow at the moment. In Moscow's thinking, there are more benefits to doing this campaign and doing this outright attack on Ukraine than their costs, or at least the costs that the top of the leadership, which is the Russian president, is willing to take. Other actors like the prime minister, or others who are more concerned about the Russian economy, might have perhaps not chosen this path. Who knows? But at least in his thinking. But what I think, which is perhaps not thought through, is that in the past, Russia has always engaged in rather smaller military mission, where it is pretty, let's not say easy, but pretty modest to calculate the cost-benefit analysis and to calculate the cost, because it was small missions. You could think about which actors would behave in which way, which sanctions would be applied, and so on. This is such a huge change and such a huge rupture that I don't think there's any way in which Moscow could have thought through the second and third order consequences of this. This is just too big to have on your mind what this can lead to down the road, and to game this out before. I mean, Syria was certainly also difficult to game out, but this is just very difficult to game out. So while this seems to be at the moment, a moment of Russian victory in Ukraine, I think down the line we will see many repercussions of second and third order, which Moscow has not calculated. And also when it comes to regime stability in Moscow, in Russia itself, when it comes to reactions of neighboring countries. So while this seems almost to be a very desperate hour, I think in the long run, this is a mistake of such a gravity for Moscow that we will see changes which can also be detrimental to Moscow's interest. And here I come back to Turkey. I do think it is plausible to assume that Moscow will try to bully Turkey into breaking up NATO unity, doing the fence sitting that it has done before. And I wonder what the consequences of this bullying will be if Turkey and Ankara is willing to let this happen, or whether sort of witnessing what is taking place in Ukraine might also lead to a hardening stance in Turkey of, well, if Russia takes that path, we don't want to be bullied by Russia, and thereby moves closer to NATO and its partners. Because I think it's very plausible that we will see these kinds of attempts from Moscow. And sort of another aspect of second and third order consequences, there have just been Twitter news that by the Turkish channel NTV that apparently Turkish ships might have come under fire. So these kind of inadvertent escalations, this is one of the consequences that we can see of the second and third order consequences, and which might quickly change the calculus that people lay out for them in such a situation.
Thank you, Liana. Thank you. Jonathan, I will start to also bring some question from the audience now, but a question that I wanted to ask you, your opinion. I mean, all military options are off the table for the US, because the American strategy of deterrence has not worked. So at this point, what can be new strategy for US? I mean, you mentioned some new sanctions coming maybe, and another question is from audience. I'm just quoting the question. It says, President Putin says West did not address Russian security concern. Is this war really about NATO expansion, or is it about democracy? At some point, it's considering the pattern of Russian action in the past vis-a-vis Ukraine and Georgia.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions. Then
on the U.S. question too, and President Biden was explicit about not having U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. I think there is. I can't say that it was universal among all NATO member states, but also maybe the larger NATO member states also shared that assessment. I think there's a couple of reasons. One, if you even look at the U.S. population, there's no appetite, and this is after, and we can go into sort of this 9/11 impact of Afghanistan and Iraq on sort of U.S. posture and deterrence globally and willingness to engage. But there's also internally within the United States, those that, particularly on the Republican side, Republican right, former President Trump, that are actually praising President Putin for his actions. So the U.S. domestic scene has a direct impact, not only in sort of congressional support, but also in the appetite of the United States, including with high inflation, as well as to the U.S. getting into this type of military conflict. If you want to bring NATO into it, NATO partners, there also has to be agreement, unanimous agreement on that, and clearly there was not. And so in the absence of that, and we can talk about whether or not, even if you put troops in there, if the US and allies would have the right mix to actually deter Putin's aggression. That's a debate worth having, and whether or not NATO has the right type of forces. And I go back to looking at what Ambassador Flake said about the type of capacities to be able to defend and deter in Europe, and whether or not after 20 years of the war against terrorism, which Turkey has been very much involved in, including in Afghanistan, obviously, in Turkey itself, has faced, whether or not the US military, whether NATO military has the right resources. So instead, Kadri, it is not just going to be a sanctions response. There will be export controls. There'll be humanitarian assistance that will be sent out. There's going to be a continuation of support, I think, militarily. Liana mentioned it's been not talked about too much lately, but as you may recall, President Biden explicitly said that the US would support an insurgency in Ukraine. What that looks like, I don't know what that exactly looks like. Does that extend to Belarus as well now that Mr. Lukashenko has decided to join with Mr. Putin? So I would expect that there's going to be all sorts of measures taking. The EU has its own measures as well. We've already seen Japan, Taiwan, Australia, Asia, partners in the Indo-Pacific step up as well. So this is certainly global. And I think some things that I'm starting to hear right now as well is, people calling for impositions of no-fly zones as well, and humanitarian zones that are going to be needed as well. We just don't fully know yet, and I think we're only in day 2, but we should expect that there's more resources and capabilities both the United States and NATO and allies and partners have that would be brought to bear. And let's not forget that, of course, when you sanction Russia or you do these things, there will be an opposite reaction as well from Russia. And I think the US, Europe, and partners have been thinking through these secondary effects. And President Biden spoke very clearly about the potential for gas prices to go up or impact in the US. And I think that will also be part of it too. This is going to be a game of whack-a-mole, whether it's cyber or energy. And I'll just end with this. Turkey has a significant energy relationship, transit country relationship with Russia. That is going to be very much in focus. When I hear, we talked about NS2, we can't forget about the pipelines coming through Turkey into Europe as well, and whether they will also end up as a factor or be impacted by decision-making both in Europe and the United States as well. So I think that's something that we really should be looking closely at.
Thank you, Jonathan. Another question from audience is, I'm just quoting the question, what was the NATO's strategy sending American troops to some Eastern European countries like Poland and Romania? What can 1,000 soldiers do in case of a war? This is the first question. Another one is about the wording that you use, the wording about the war wording. Galip is giving different example from Greece MFA, Russian attack, French MFA, military invasion, German MFA attack, etc. So the question is, are you therefore suggesting that if the other NATO member state change their wording, and Turkey would have to decide what to do, or will all continue to hedge? This is the second question. Liana, maybe we can start with you, and if the others or Maryna want to answer. And then
just very quickly, perhaps on the NATO troops. I mean, that was very clearly signaled as a message that troops are there to reassure Eastern member states, and obviously not as troops to get involved in any fighting in Ukraine. This is certainly good to repeat it again and again, and the US president has done this in the past. These are not troops that will engage in any fighting in Ukraine, which might lead to a NATO-Russia escalation. So this is certainly not a concern that we have to entertain right now, given all the other concerns. But I do think that we will see more of that. So the reassurance of Eastern members, this attack on Ukraine is to some extent also perceived by NATO and European Union member states as an attack on their own security. So this is perhaps for the first time that there was a very strong threat perception in security and sort of in the security and military realm. Just because of the fact that someone is willing to do this kind of war with this justification in quotation marks. So we will see more US troops. Europeans will demand more US troops in Europe. As I said, the NATO-Russia Founding Act will certainly be discussed, and there's certainly a fair argument to make that this founding act is not complied with by Russia anymore with what it's doing in Ukraine. But I think in the long term, and Jonathan mentioned that, I think for Europeans it will not be enough to just call on Washington to send more troops, because Washington has these dual priorities with China, and it will be now the moment for Europeans to step up on their own defense. I mean, there's just no way that this is not happening. The whole 2% debate that we had I mean, I think the Russian president has done now more than any other, including President Trump in the past, to bring Europeans to the realization that they need to take care of their own security. And certainly that they can't just leave this to the United States, as it has been the case in the past. And this would be, especially stepping up within NATO, but perhaps also EU security and defense, would also help the United States to lift the burden that they will have with, as Jonathan described it, with basically two areas where they have to engage in deterrence, to in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. So that this is a moment of truth for Europeans when it comes to their own security and defense. And I think it will lead to a change in the mindset of Europeans.
Thank you so much, Liana. Do you want to comment, Maryna?
Yes, just on NATO, I think since we touched already on NATO's trying to deter Russia at what can be done at the moment, I will just add a bit and shift just to bring another perspective, what NATO can do on Ukraine at the moment, since the diplomacy failed. And I think that we've seen a really very impressive display of solidarity in the days coming up to the aggression, and very reassuring messaging to Kiev that nothing will be decided about Ukraine without Ukraine. So some very strong worded messages, etc. But at the same time, I think what has been worrying, and I don't know if it had brought, if it contributed anyhow to Russia's believing that it can go for that, and this aggression will be not as costly as it could be, is that the messaging has been controversial there. And I think we've discussed this a bit today about what we've heard. One of the things that openly advertising that sending troops to Ukraine is not in the cards. I'm used to say that it's really not something that had to be done, even if this, I mean, if this was discussed behind the closed doors, since this immediately, was ruled out in Kremlin as a scenario not to be, not to count with, and this undermines seriously the strategic ambiguity that the West and the US in particular wanted to hold around Ukraine. And then certain countries, Germany, France, having those deep-seated sympathies to Russian traumas, openly signaling this to Moscow, and being much less sensitive about Ukrainian traumas inflicted by Moscow. And I mean, the list could here go on. So what I'm saying now it's time to remedy the shortcomings. So now the time to come up with the effective Russia policy. And this is, of course, is very much zoomed to Ukraine and what we do now to help Ukraine defend itself if no troops are coming to the ground. And so there was already the request already from Kiev, ranging from the financial and humanitarian help, helping with the weapons, but sanctions are very crucial here. I mean, some did not expect the sanctions that we've heard the last days. Some of them were really even more impressive than one could count on, but still I think one has to climb up this escalation ladder of sanctions. And while of course it's good to sanction some of the oligarchs close to Putin, or to put under pressure or under sanctions some certain Russian banks, I don't see the nuclear option sanctions being employed at the moment. I hope very much that these options are there under discussion in the cabinets at the moment and the offices in different capitals, and we will see a more robust approach. So this is just a short and very short reaction to what I've heard, the interesting comments made by colleagues before on Turkey, a bit since the discussion is on Turkey. I think everything that is happening now Ankara needs to reconsider the approach that it was very much upholding as a certain mantra, that of the securities regional ownership in the region. And I think it was elusive to think, and it was illusionary to think about security in the Black Sea being sufficiently guaranteed by Turkey, Russia, and the littoral states, since we see basically that Russia was not really doing this and was really actually monopolizing the security for itself only. And Turkey being always very cautious about more solid NATO's posture in the region. I think now this approach is very seriously challenged by the realities on the ground, what was already mentioned by somebody here. So Turkey will obviously be pressurized as a NATO ally in this direction. And also, somebody asked in the chat, also I've seen the question, I mean, what is about the relationship or defense cooperation with Ukraine? What is going to happen? I mean, I think also Ankara well understands that compartmentalize indefinitely. I mean, it has been efficient in trying to compartmentalize certain dossiers with Russia. So both countries, they manage this quite effectively. I mean, with a differing efficiency in different directions. But in Libya and Syria or in Nagorno-Karabakh, managed, to detach some conflicting issues from the general cooperative framework. But let us remember that Ukraine is not Nagorno-Karabakh or Syria or Libya for Russia. It's a number one, tier one issue, vital security issue for Russia. And Turkey now will see that this is already a dangerous brinkmanship in Moscow's eyes, if it wants to pursue or continue or even enhance, boost this cooperation with Russia, with Ukraine. Sorry. So I think that really this means the security choice, which does not invalidate, I think, or actually the point that I want to make, that actually supported actually by the opinions of many reputable voices in Turkey, that this is the time for Turkey to prove and to reinstate its NATO vocation, its NATO identity, I think Galip said, this, to show where its anchor is. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Maryna. Before I turn to you, Galip, we have 15 minutes left. We have another GMF event on Ukraine starting at 4:30. So I have to really end this meeting at 4:30. So I have 15 minutes. We have still a lot of question. Please try to answer briefly. And I'm glad that, Maryna, you have already picked a question and even answered it. So you can answer the previous question that I asked you, but there's also another question to you and to Liana. The question is following, in the case of deep, long-standing NATO escalation, where do you see Turkey standing? You have already actually answered this question. But the second question is about the economic tourism. Could Turkey be considering to close its border to the Russian citizen? This is one question, but I would like to also bring another question from Stephen Flanagan. It's about the Montreux Convention again, because he says, I quote, with regard to the continued passage of resupply of Russian military vessels through the strait, Article 21 of Montreux Convention gives the Turkish government the right to restrict the passage if we consider herself to be treated with the imminent danger of war, of course. To continue to restrict passage through the strait, Turkey has to secure concurrence from majority of other contracting parties of the convention. He says, I expect most Turkey's NATO allies that are contracting parties, UK, Italy, etc., would support Turkey's decision. Under what circumstance, he asked, might Turkey exercise this right? Over to you, please, very briefly, Galip.
Sure. Well, first, I mean, the question about the wording and vocabulary. Yes, I do think that the wording will have the policy implication, and this is why all these European or the US choosing the wording that they are choosing, because the wording carries the policy implications. So if the wording changes, then yes, the policy will changes follow as well too. Secondly, just exactly what Maryna rightly said, there is a major distinction between when it comes to Turkish-Russian engagement in places like North Africa or Middle East and Turkish-Russian engagement in post-Soviet space, but most importantly in Ukraine. whereas Russia looks at the crisis in places like Syria and Libya through the perspective of power projection, influence projection, or status projection. It looks at the issue in Ukraine through its conception of national security. So this difference in the changes, this difference in the lenses very much will define the policy as well too. And therefore there will be extremely more sensitivity when it comes to engagements between the both sides in the post-Soviet space, not only in Ukraine, but also it will be in other post-Soviet countries as well too. Maybe not as much as it would be in Ukraine, but also in Central Asia, in South Caucasus. So I think this is the terrain where the Turkish-Russian relationship will be very much tested, and will the vulnerability and the fragility of it will be very much reflected. Another point is, I think, to the Europeans, because there has been all this talk about the European security architecture. The Ukrainian crisis has shown how shallow this discussion is. The EU as an entity meant very little actually during the Ukrainian crisis, and the non-EU member of the NATO countries played a much more important role, be it the US, be it the UK, be it the Turkey. And the universe within which the European security conversation, the European security structure conversation take place has dramatically changed. The UK now, how the UK is going to feature in the European security architecture is a question that needs to be answered. How Turkey is going to feature in the European security architecture is a question that needs to be answered. For long, the French, German, Italian leaders called for a new approach to Russia. The Macron, for instance, said, well, we should not look at the Russia from an enemy perspective. Maybe we should look at the Russia from a partner perspective when it comes to European security. So in the new design of the European security, is Russia going to be, in a sense, the enemy of the new European security order? Is this going to be designed in a way to confront Russia, or how is it going to be designed? Fourthly is about the US. I mean, the European security particularly after the Second World War, very much the European security conversation took place within a larger framework that was defined by the US security guarantees. The US that now has to engage in a much more animated rivalry with China and Russia at the same time would have implication on the European security conversation. Therefore, thus far, the European security conversation has been, how to put it in a nice diplomatic way, quite detached from many realities. I think that will be the most diplomatic way to put it. Otherwise, that would not be very nice. So how the European security conversation is going to deal with this four major factors? Because right now, most of the conversation coming from the capitals, Paris, Rome, or Berlin, is quite detached from the reality. And I think once we have a real European security architecture, the next question will be not only the role of Turkey, how it's going to deal with UK, with Turkey, with US, but also how is it going to define itself vis-a-vis Russia.
Thank you very much, Galip. Let me to bring some question. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to manage this. Well, there is a mention of the potential humanitarian corridor in Ukraine to shield the migrants. I don't know if you see this question. The question is, such a shield would be operated by NATO member, or do you see escalation potential in such scenario? And how could a NATO-Russia escalation unfold? This is the first question. Another one is, Alan Markowski is asking, can we assume that the emplacement of a pro-Russian government in Kiev would mean the end of Turkish-Ukrainian military cooperation? If so, what would be the impact on Turkey's short and long-term military plans? And another question specifically asked to you, Jonathan, in the case of this West reaction, he says, I quote, how is possible in this Putin's invasion to Ukraine to constitute a paradigm for other strong autocratic leaders or illiberal regimes. He's given Chinese or Turkey's role in the East Med or Cyprus cases, etc. So very briefly, please go ahead.
Let me just one on the humanitarian corridor, if I could just jump in quickly. I wouldn't envision. I think this would be a UN-led process with strong support from the EU. I don't necessarily see a role for NATO. When we think about countries like Moldova that are neutral in sort of their foreign policy status and outlook, I think that would probably be the most significant way to, or the best way to do it would be to bring in the UN and then bring in the EU and other international actors that would include the United States, which over the last 8 years has provided tens of millions of dollars for the humanitarian crisis that occurred in the Donbass and because of Crimea as well. We forget about the displacement of millions of Ukrainians already previously. This is going to be incredibly significant all along these border areas, from Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, going up to Poland, but also because of the role of Belarus in this as well into Baltic states. So I think I would expect to see this be humanitarian. I'd like to see it move quickly. And then the demand to be able for humanitarian support to go inside of Ukraine, to be on the ground, and also to be the eyes and ears important to prevent any atrocities as well. And I think this is particularly important. And my expectation is that governments, the Moldovan government today declared a state of emergency because of this humanitarian situation, but also because they're threatened as well by potentially what could happen if Putin decides to go over the border. And then we had the question about values, democracy, illiberalism. This is an underlying issue in the U.S.-EU Turkish relationship. Has been this issue when we had the summit of democracy that President Biden led in December. Obviously Turkey wasn't looked to as a partner in this process. And I do think that when you have countries within NATO that are autocratic or autocratic-like, when their leadership is like this, I don't view Turkey as an autocratic country. I view leaders, that carry out activities as being autocratic. And in this case, I think the underlying distrust in Erdogan is one of these reasons why, Galip, that you didn't see, the U.S. reaching out. It's whether you question whether, I think they understand fully Turkey's interest in spaces like Syria, some of these other challenges as well. That's understood. But the question of trusting partners that share the same values, I think will be hyper emphasized. And you said, Galip, and I'll go back to you too, we're no longer in the last 20-year period where we were looking at competition differently. We are in an era, though, of strategic competition. President Biden has been very clear about democracy being the the flag for this era of strategic competition. And when seeing Turkey backslide the way that it has had an impact on the relationship. There's other things as well, and I won't dismiss the security concerns that Turkey has. I think the U.S. has to come to the table as well to look at that and find new ways to cooperate. But the democracy issue and the values issue is really important. And when you see Hungary and Viktor Orban going to Moscow, and I'll point out Hungary, they have upcoming elections in just a few weeks, you realize how fragile NATO is in the EU when you have members internally that are open to business with Putin, open to business with China. And this will be a particularly important issue on all ends to try to address. And this will be part of sitting on two fences is going to include countries that share the same values, as well as sort of strategic military interests. They're both going to be there. And I think you'll see that in the Biden administration national security strategy coming out fairly soon.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We have only 5 minutes left. I will give you floor to have just your last thought, but with this question, maybe the question is about Sinemadar is asking if you can elaborate. We don't have the time to elaborate, but one point that Turkey should strengthen its NATO commitment. In your opinion, she asked, what kind of action, from Turkey at this point would signal such commitment, especially given that Turkey has already intensified its contribution to NATO mission in the Black Sea. So please, very briefly, I can start with you, maybe, Liana.
Yes, thank you. I think some of the answers to this question we already have discussed. It will be certainly sort of Article 4 meetings that are now being demanded, and then, which is not in the NATO context, but later down the road, the sanctions question. What I would like to address just very shortly before we end is the question of the European security architecture and sort of finding a European security architecture where Turkey as well as Russia fit in, as Galip outlined. I'm a little bit afraid that Russia has now closed the doors, slammed the door for any discussions about European security architecture, because in a time like crisis and escalation like this, everyone withdraws to the security that you have, the things you know, and you strengthen the things you know, and you strengthen yourself. So we will see, I guess we already discussed the strengthening of NATO, and at some point down the road, and I mean, the Cold War had its dark times, and we still had the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. So at some point down the road, there will be certainly a point in time when discussions about European security architecture will be possible. But I think now it is all back to everyone defend themselves as good as they can and showing up support within the EU and NATO.
Thank you so much, Liana. Galip, 1 minute, please.
I think I agree with Liana. In a sense, what has happened yesterday is the 0 hour of the European security architecture that will require a new conversation, because actually in the past few years, there wasn't a dramatic difference between the European approach to Russia and the Turkish approach to Russia. Like, for instance, France didn't see a Russian presence in East Med or Libya as a major security threat. The Turkey engaged in S-400. Germany was like, with Nord Stream 2. I think right now, it's a dramatically different period. It's the 0 hour of a new European security architecture that needs to take account the reality of the new period. And I think this will inevitably happen. And I think the Putin condemned Russia to be a junior partner of China with what it did. Like, I don't see how he is going to emerge as victorious. I think he represents one of these prophetic presidents who is full of illusions, and I think soon this illusion will be blown out.
Thank you so much, Galip. Maryna, sorry, we have to really end. Just you have 1 minute, and then I have to go.
Just 1 minute then. That never Turkey's strategic role is appreciated so much as in the times of crisis, as we witness now. So Turkey should be up to the challenge, I believe. And I think it's it just saw how Russia perceives its mediation offers. So there was no space for that, obviously. So the costs of giving up to Russian challenge, Russian pressure as a Russian strategic partner outweighs actually the cost of openly confronting Russia, I would argue, as a NATO ally. So I think this NATO vocation is a very crucial at the moment.
Thank you so much, Maryna. Well, Liana, Galip, Maryna, and Jonathan, thank you very much. It was really great. And I have to apologize to the audience because we had other questions that unfortunately we didn't have the time to answer. And let me also thank to my colleague Annika and Alberto who helped to put all of this together. And of course, above all, thanks to all of you who have joined us. And thank you, and hope to see you again soon. Good afternoon. Bye.